Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our webinar. Today's webinar is about the new competitive grants reporting requirements. We have quite a bit of slides to go through. Just a couple of logistical things to get folks oriented to how this is going to work today. As usual for our webinars, the phone lines have been muted, so you won't be able to ask questions by phone. But there is a questions box in the toolbar to the right of your screen. If you click on that, you can submit questions through that function. I encourage you to do that throughout the webinar. We will save a few minutes at the end of the webinar for questions. We'll also be aggregating all of the questions that we get today in case we don't get through all of them during the time we have allotted. And then we will be creating a fact sheet with the questions and the answers for everyone. The webinar will also be recorded, so there will be an opportunity to re-listen to it if you need to do that as well. As usual, we do have a short survey that will pop up at the end of the webinar. It's just 3 questions, but one of those questions is an opportunity for you to ask anything else. If you think of any other questions, say after the webinar today and you get the survey by email tomorrow and you've thought of another question, that survey tool is a great way to get those questions answered. So with that, the sort of initial things out of the way, I'd like to introduce Brad Sickles from Department of Labor, Veterans Employment and Training Services. He's going to be leading the content today for the webinar. So Brad, take it away.
Thank you very much, Cindy. I appreciate that introduction and overview. Today's session, as Cindy said, is covering the reporting requirements for the competitive grants. And you all have copies of the forms that were approved by OMB a few months ago, and hopefully you had a chance to look through them, and as we go through the slides today, it'll make more sense to you. Typically the presentation, I've done this once before, and it takes roughly about 45 minutes. So we should have hopefully at least a half an hour or so for questions, because this is really your session. I'm sure I can cover a lot, just by going through the slides, but there's things that I just can't anticipate in terms of what you're interested in knowing, and we'll have plenty of time for that. Could you go to the next slide, please, Cindy? The first bullet item, we'll talk about the agenda here, is talking about a veterans program letter that's coming out in the next week or so. It's in its final draft stage right now and will be released very shortly. There might be, and that draft VPL was also shared with you, I believe, or maybe not. Maybe I'm thinking of somebody else. I'm sorry. Never mind. Another presentation. No, we'll be covering the contents of the draft VPL in this session today. Largely, it talks about transmitting the forms that were approved by OMB. There's the VETS 700, which is the participant planning form. There's the VETS 701 forms, which are typically your old technical performance report forms. They've been now merged into one workbook, so there can be now a plan versus actual comparison on the TPR itself. When we go through the technical performance workbook, I'll be going through it in kind of 2 major steps. The first is talking about the data entry tabs, which are the ones that are actually covered by the OMB reporting requirements. The summary report tabs, things like the demographic summary, and there's also the actual technical performance report that's doing all the computations, are nothing more than formula worksheets, and they can be modified at any point in time if need be to address any sort of changes in terms of displaying the data. We'll also cover the technical performance narrative. The TPR and the TPN now are better integrated. You'll find that when we go over the TPR, it's got a stoplight method on there, and depending upon your type of grant and the performance indicators that apply to it and your performance, it does a plan versus actual comparison. And if the indicator has a green stoplight, it means performance is at or above what was the goal for the program. If it is a yellow indicator, it means performance is below the goal but above 85% of the goal. And if it's a red indicator, it means performance is less than 85% of the target. Depending upon the indicators, if you get a yellow or or red, that indicates that you have to complete a corrective action plan or provide additional information on the TPN itself. And we'll get into more detail on these forms later on. The final report that we have here is the stand down after action report. This is being shared with you because beginning in PY17, stand down activities will be added to the funding opportunity announcement. So the PY17 competition, you can actually propose having stand down events as part of your outreach strategy, and this will be the form for tracking the outcomes of that stand down event, totally separate than the others. Then we'll talk about next steps in terms of guidance coming out and future actions in terms of having additional webinars for your information. And last but not least, answering any sort of questions you may have about this whole document. Next slide, please. In the draft VPL, the VPL actually is nothing more than formally transmitting an already approved reporting requirement. As mentioned before, it's got 4 types of forms that are in there. 2 of them are actually located in the same workbook. 700 and 701 are located in the TPR workbook. 702, the TPN, is a standalone, and the 703 is a standalone too. The TPN and the stand down after action report are both narrative reports. There's no calculations that actually go into those reports at all. Also mentioned here that, and make clear, there's no change to the federal financial report form. The changes we're discussing today are strictly applying to the programmatic reporting forms applying to competitive grantees. As a note, forms are valid through September 30th, 2019. At that point in time, we'll have to go back to OMB for approval of a new set of forms or continuation of the existing forms. As something to highlight here is that when we talk about submitting reports, there's a separate report that's required for each grant award. So if you have 2 grants, let's say, you're submitting a separate report for each grant, just to make that clear. The due date for the TPR workbook, the technical performance narrative, is 30, or it's actually 1 month after the end of the reporting quarter. The exception is the stand down after action report, which has a due date of 30 days after the conclusion of the stand down event itself. For this particular, in the guidance it will show that we've extended the due date for the second quarter reports to February 15th to allow you to copy or actually transfer data from the old technical performance workbook to the new workbook itself. It shouldn't be that difficult. We've only added a few data elements. Most of the data elements are the same. To the existing data elements you have on there, there's no coding changes, but we have added maybe 10 or 12 data elements to that form that you have to provide information for. Largely applying to those new grants that were awarded in PY16, where we're tracking characteristics like IVTP, seamless home health veteran, homeless veterans with families, and chronically homeless, tracking those characteristics a little better there. And then finally, typically this VPL on reporting is issued in addition to instructions on doing corrective action plans, as well as our option year guidance. Those VPLs will be issued later this month, and our plan is to do another webinar like this to announce the changes to the option year award process so you can digest that and become familiar with it. Next slide. First bullet here is I want to make it very clear that VOPAR is going away. It is almost effectively dead for the HVRP program right now, largely because of the cost in terms of maintaining the old system, its antiquated programming language, and the need to really kind of move forward and create maybe online data entry screens for grantees to use in the future. So moving away from the workbooks altogether into an entirely different system. We anticipate it will take maybe 2 to 3 years to roll out this new system after acquiring, the business processes and the programming language and doing pilot tests of the forms themselves. In the interim, for the next 2 years or 3 years, grantees will be emailing the TPR workbook, the TPN form, the stand down after action report to your GOTR or DVET, who's responsible for your grant. They in turn will be reviewing the information on those spreadsheets just to make sure it's complete and the data appears to be reasonable, and work with you in the event that there's some questions about the integrity of the data or maybe some missing information that you could easily provide. So once they've provided, I'm sorry, one more. There we go. Once they have certified the report, they'll be uploading it to the national office. Now, under this approach, there's no more data entry on your part as a grantee. You're not taking data from the TPR and plug it into another data entry screen itself. You're not doing that at all anymore. We've kind of created a system where there are data extracts that are coming directly from the technical performance workbook, that Excel workbook that you submit, and we're going to extract it and merge the data at the national office. So once it's been certified by the DVET, the national office will actually merge the data together, and that's how our reports will be run in the future, at least for the this temporary or Band-Aid approach interim 2-year period. The naming convention is slightly different than what you've seen in the past. I want to point out there's, after the HV 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, there's a letter there, I. I forgot to indicate that on this list here in terms of what it means, but it's covered in the technical assistance guide that's being updated right now, being tweaked a little bit. The I indicates the type of award. I stands for initial, and there's a 1, 2, or 3, depending upon the option year that was available to you. So if it's your second year, option year, then it would be a 2 there instead of an I. If it's your initial grant award, then it would have an I. It's there just so we can distinguish the type of award that you have and how to process that information. Something to point out that this workbook, the Excel workbook, is saved as an Excel binary. It's a macro-enabled workbook. It has a lot of formulas in there which make this file incredibly large in terms of the edit checks and the formulas that are in there for computing different outcomes. Our goal is to actually kind of work with that and try and streamline the formulas over the next few months and reissue it for PY 2017 to make it so it works much better than it is right now. It's being rolled out now because we really need the data for reporting to Congress that isn't currently available through the system, especially for the PY16 grantees. So you can see it's pretty much a standard format you've seen in the past. When you look at the stand down after action report, SDAAR, the FI just means it's the final report. And that's what you would enter for that particular type of grant. There would not be a quarters 1 through 8. It would just be a final report. Next slide, please. As mentioned before, we've combined the plan goals chart into the TPR workbook itself. So when you enter in the plan goals and you have the actual performance, it's doing a plan versus actual comparison on a quarterly basis for the grant, and will automatically flag your performance with on the critical indicators with a stoplight color of red, yellow, or green. There's also better integration with the technical performance narrative. Depending upon the color of the indicator that you have to address, it will direct you to actually address that underperformance in the technical performance narrative. And we'll get more into the color codes here, but basically a yellow means that you don't have to do a corrective action plan, but you really have to tell us why you're not performing up to the goal that you had anticipated. If it's in red, then you submit a corrective action plan as part of the TPN. It's just automatic. You're required to do it automatically. Data elements that were added to the technical performance report workbook. It now includes the ability to carry over participants. starting with this one, this particular workbook. So at the end of your grant, let's say for this program year, if you have individuals you want carried forward to a subsequent grant that was awarded to an option year awarded grant, you would just leave the individuals as being not exited in that workbook, and we automatically expect them to be carried over to your next grant award. Kind of how that's going to work. If you enter in an exit quarter in there, then they're exited in that particular workbook. But if you don't enter in an exit quarter, they're automatically considered to be carryover participants into the future award. There's also a field in there for co-enrollment of participants in the American Job Center services. One of those requirements that was added to the HVRP terms and conditions this past year. It also added in the characteristics and tracking outcomes for persons in special population groups, and those would be the chronically homeless, female homeless veterans, homeless veterans with families, and incarcerated veterans are the four characteristic groups that we're tracking. It also computes placement for the chronically homeless, and that's in here because starting in PY17 with that FOA particular solicitation, we're changing the metrics for PY17 going forward. So that metric would not apply to your grants, but it gives you an indication how you're performing on it when you're going forward into the next year. And it would apply to FY17 grants moving forward, or PY17 grants moving forward, excuse me. There's also the huge change of this is it changes to the collection and reporting of race and ethnicity when you look at the technical performance workbook itself. We've been collecting that information incorrectly for the past several years in violation of OMB requirements, and now it's been corrected in the form itself. Instead of just being one field where we had ethnicity and race combined, they're now separate data elements. There's a separate data element for ethnicity, whether Hispanic or not Hispanic, and then there's separate data elements for each racial category that might apply to them. So if they're multiracial, it's reported as have them indicating, let's say they're Asian and also African American, they would check both boxes for those characteristics on the workbook data entry form itself. That would flag it as being multiracial. Changes were also made to move forward with integration of the Workforce Innovation Opportunity Act, post-program employment and earnings measures. Those are employment in the second quarter after exit, employment in the fourth quarter after exit, and median earnings in the second quarter after exit. We'll talk more about those in a few minutes here. But the WIA post-program employment program measures are largely advisory at this point in time. They're not being used for program management purposes or grant management purposes. They're more evaluative in nature. It's information that Congress and OMB in particular are interested in seeing for evaluating the program impacts in the long term. Another change was adding in data elements for tracking stand-down costs and when they occur. And yes, that's what all it means there. Next slide, please. Other additions to the data elements, we've aligned the definition of exiters with WIA and WIA. In the past, we had exit after the quarter of an enrollment. We didn't allow them to exit in the quarter. And the change is made now to allow you to declare an exit in the quarter that they were served if they should exit that quarter. So if they were in a 2-month program in the second quarter, then it's just that's how we're kind of aligning. They can actually exit in the second quarter as well as enroll in that second quarter if they needed to. So that was a huge change. That was to align it with the proper use in WIA and WIOA. It doesn't really affect outcome calculations much. It's just how the data is collected and reported to us. Something being much more accurate and reflective of what's going on. The placement rate calculation is being changed, and I'll explain why. The placement rate in the past has been defined as the number of placements divided by the number of total enrollments for the grant. Well, since we're going to allow individuals to carry participants forward if they need to, the denominator is now being changed to exiters. So it's the number of placed divided by the number of exiters. you should see performance go up on each quarter, because currently when you're defining it based on placements divided by enrollments, it's kind of an artificially deflated number because you're including in the denominator individuals who haven't really had a chance to get a job yet. They may be new enrollments. So when you base that on exiters, you're getting a much better picture of those who have completed services, have exited the program, and looking at their outcomes that way. So you'll see performance going up on a quarterly basis based on that. Mentioned earlier that we have a stoplight indicator tool that was added to summarize performance on the critical performance indicators that apply to your grant award, as well as some selected non-critical data elements. Those non-critical data elements are the percent of individuals who receive training, and also data elements on, I think it's 2 or 3 data elements on the expenditures of your program, comparing it to plan versus actual. So I just want to alert you to those. Those are the additional ones that were added to the critical indicators. Each worksheet will now accommodate up to 1,000 row data entries. I may abbreviate that in terms of cutting us down, but currently they're all maxed at 1,000 individuals, 1,000 participants you can have per program, or per grant. We also added in 3 worksheet tabs to export data for merging and generating reports. As I mentioned earlier, there's no more data entry on your part outside of the TPR. Once you've entered it into the workbook, it's been certified by the DVET. It is now ready for merging into a larger database. And we'll cover the process for how that's accomplished later on. So just to let you know, there's no more data entry on your part. You just submit the report directly to your DVET via email. Next slide, please. You notice that the TPR workbook, also has in there post-program outcomes. And many of your grants, the PY16 grants, for example, don't collect post-program outcomes. We had the change from the grant officer that took effect this past year that pretty much eliminated tracking outcomes beyond the second quarter after exit. So according to what applies to your grant award, you only report those outcomes for the quarters that are applicable per the terms and conditions of your grant award. Now you're also able to add in the additional information if you want to track post-program outcomes for your own information, and report that to us. But there's no requirement for you to do that beyond the first quarter after exit right now. The additional quarters are also in there in anticipation of the direction we're moving in PY17. Through the option year award process, we're looking at putting all grantees on the same set of metrics, performance metrics. So you would all be aligned with the performance indicators that will be included in the PY17 FOA. Just to mention about how that's going to be paid for, because I'm sure you're probably questioning, how can you collect follow-up data on a grant award when you don't have funds for it and the grant is expired? The terms and conditions of the grant awards in PY17 going forward, and that would include the option year awards, will include a provision in there that you collect post-program follow-up data on your previous grant award and report it under that old TPR, and keep submitting that TPR until the outcomes are all attained there. The money for collecting the follow-up, well, is paid by that subsequent grant award. So if you have your initial award, the option year award 1 would actually pay for the collection of the data that's being reported for that initial year award. Next slide, please. I just mentioned this a few minutes ago. Grantees receiving subsequent awards are still required to submit separate TPRs for both the initial award and the subsequent award. So it's quite possible you're submitting 2 TPRs, one for the previous year as well as for the current program year. If your grant does not receive a subsequent award, there is no requirement on your part or obligation to collect and report follow-up data. And again, the collection, reporting, of follow-up results, as you see on this form itself, is seen as being a temporary solution, a temporary kind of approach right now. As you know, we're requiring co-enrollment for all HVRP grantees to have their participants co-enrolled in AJC services. The intent there was, once they're enrolled in AJC services, they begin being tracked in ETA's performance reporting system, where we're getting the wage record matches from the states, and where it's tracking employment earnings through the use of unemployment insurance wage record data. Unfortunately, the new reporting system for WIOA is brand new. It has some bugs there. It was implemented a little bit late for grantees to get into place. So there's anticipation that the data for this first year under the ETA reporting requirements for the WIOA may not be reliable. So that's why VETS had opted to continue collecting the post-program employment earnings data through grantees instead of through the wage record data. Once we're firm on the reliability of the wage record data that's included in ETA's reporting system, we'll drop the requirement that grantees collect post-program employment data and report it to ETA, because then we'll have it from, we'll have that information already from DOL's online approach. Next slide, please. Next, I'd like to talk about the data entry worksheets, and I have snapshots of the worksheets. Some they're in sections. For some of them are very large worksheets. We'll start with the technical performance report data workbook and go over the data entry screens there and highlight the changes that were made to the prior form itself. So here's a snapshot or a picture of the VETS 700 plan goals chart. You'll see that I can't see the whole thing there. Oh, the plan goals, as mentioned before, has been incorporated in the workbook so we can do a plan versus actual comparison. The data feeds that are in here, as I mentioned, are used and fed into the actual technical performance report summary to do that plan versus actual comparison with the stoplight. The number of exiters has been aligned with WIA, so now the denominator for the placement rate is based on the number of exiters instead of the number of enrollments. It adds in the placement for chronically homeless as a data element that is advisory for you this time, but in PY17 going forward, it would be applicable. It retains the WIA indicators for PY 2016 and earlier grants, largely because we have grants, as I mentioned before, we have grants that are under different sets of indicators. And some of the grants, as I mentioned before, still have, for example, an entered employment in the first quarter after exit goal that they're still reporting on. So we'll phase out the WIA indicators beginning in PY17. But they're here right now because of the types of grants and the different types of indicators they have for them. It also adds in the WIOA post-program employment earnings indicators for PY17 and later grants, or 16 and later grants, excuse me. Next slide, please. Uh-oh. All right, Cindy, I just goofed something up. I need to take a break here for just a minute, if you hold. I was trying to uncover some detailed information, and I've kind of messed up my slides. Cindy, if you come over and help me?
Yep, I'll be right here.
I apologize for the inconvenience, guys. It's my first time using this GoToWebinar, and I'm apparently not a very good student learning. The slide was covered up. I tried to uncover it, and that's all I got involved screwed up here. See how this box covers up? Okay, you would do that.
Or we can just
You can close it. Okay. I'm sorry for that. Okay. Okay, I wasn't able to see. All right. Thank you very much, Cindy, and thank you for your patience on that. Again, it's my lack of technical skills on using this particular software. This is also another section of the plan goals chart, and on it you'll see that the very bottom in the expenditure category we added back in where you're reporting expenditures for stand down and grants. So, and again, as a reminder that when you do a stand down event, you have 30 days after the conclusion of the event to actually submit that final programmatic report for stand down. Next slide, please. Here we get into the primary data entry form that you'll be using for this program year. Just to go over a couple of things here, there's the participant ID and the name, scrambled name, have to be entered on this form. And I'll explain that a little bit later, but you'll see it actually demonstrated. That information is actually feeding into an individual record data file that is being submitted as part of your TPR workbook. And that information entered on there also feeds into the exit tabs for collecting and reporting post-program employment earnings data. Now, in the past, those post-program data tabs or exit tabs were used for those who had actually entered employment. Remember, you only followed up on individuals who were retained. With the WIA measures, there is no retention measure anymore. There's employment in the second quarter after exit, and then there's employment in the fourth quarter after exit. So you'll be reporting on all exiters in those post-program employment tabs. We also added in carryover participant as a data element. You'll see that on here. You just sort of click that and it'll indicate it to us. There's ethnicity and racial groups you'll see over to the far right of the screen where they're reported separately now. Now each of these, I would say with the exception of just a few, are drop-down response categories. They're fixed responses. So the only exception might be something like the hourly wage at placement where you actually key in an actual dollar value. But the others, you're just dropping down and you're actually selecting from the list in the drop-down box. And as mentioned before, it will accommodate up to 1,000 participant data entries here. Next slide, please. You see on this form, we actually computed a new data elements for multiracial that's now being reported on the demographics form. Instead of just, you'll have the individuals in terms of the numbers that fall into or are single race, you have the multi-race, and then if you wanted to know more about the multi-race, you can actually see what are the multiracial categories. So it's giving you a number of different ways of viewing the data, and we'll cover that more in the demographics report tab. Also gives you an example here of the drop-down box. You can see it in the form itself. On this form, we've also added in homeless family with family as a data element, and added in IVTP. The one for female homeless veterans, we already correct gender, so that's how that data indicator is being flagged. Next slide, please. In the past on the TPR, when you had the where you were listing the percentage of individuals receiving training services, you actually had to provide that number, key it in. The big change on this here, right here, or in this form itself, is the calculations being done for you automatically now, so you don't have to key that information in. It's automatically fed into the technical performance workbook summary. Next slide, please. You'll see the data elements in the slides, the tabs, they are largely the same as what you've seen in the past. A little bit cosmetic changes, but not too much. This would be the exit form that only a few grantees will be using. Those that still have performance on the first quarter after exit that apply to them would still complete this form for their grant. You can see on the gray area here, it's shaded out. That information from an exiters would automatically feed into the form itself. So if you have a grantee that's enrolled and they exit in the first quarter, they would show up in this form. If they exit in the second quarter, they would show up in that post-exit second quarter form and not this form. So depending upon the quarter you choose for the exit, that's when they pop up for collecting follow-up information. And it's pretty straightforward here. The only change to this form itself is that we've added in another quarter. In the past, this form only had collected up to 7 quarters, or 3 quarters post-program. Now it's collecting 4 quarters post-program. You think it captures information for WIO and WIA performance measures. As I mentioned before, follow-up now is required on everybody in all quarters, regardless of, we're not looking at their status at employment. If they're employed, we're looking at their status in any quarter, so you're collecting outcomes for each of the 4 quarters after exit. The technical assistance guide actually has a nice little attachment to it in the very back there, attachment, that shows you when you need to collect information and report it for the different post-exit tabs that we have here. There is a refresh list of participants button you see at the very top there. This is a macro that's built into the form. When the names are feeding in, they're feeding in the same order that they occur on the participants information tab there. So it's very possible you could have blanks that are in there because somebody exited, they entered the first and exited in the fourth. So you might have some blanks that occur in there. If there are blank rows in there, just select the Remove Blank Rows button at the very top there, and it will list all of the individuals that actually apply to follow-up for that particular quarter of exiters. And again, it accommodates up to 1,000 individuals. Next slide, please. As I mentioned before, the tag has an easy-to-understand table that's an attachment at the very end there that shows you when you need to collect the post-program information and report it. And we're showing just the first one here for quarter 1, but the quarters 2 through quarters 4 are identical to this data entry form. They're just collecting the same data for different quarters, if that makes any sense. So it's pretty much the same look and feel, it's just different quarters depending upon when they exited the program. Next slide. I think this is the last of the data entry screens that we have here. And this actually occurs on the technical performance report form itself, that summary report. There are two data entry, or two areas for data entry on this form. One at the very top, where you're still keying in the number of assessments that take place, because if they're not a participant, they shouldn't show up in the actual participant information form, or tab itself. And at the very bottom here, you're actually reporting actual expenditures by quarter. So those are the big changes there. We also did in the stand downs. You'll see that appears on there now. Next slide, please. Next, we'll get into looking at how the report summary form works itself, that we just covered a little bit in the previous slide here. This particular graphic you see on this slide shows how the stoplight indicators work. The stoplight indicators weren't operating on the screenshots we showed earlier because there was no data in there. Once data is in there and you identify the type of grant award that you have, it will actually display the indicators for the critical measures that apply to your grant. So if the grant does not, or the critical measure does not apply to your grant, it will not be flagged. It only flags those that actually apply to your grant, depending upon how you choose that. And again, the color of the stoplight depends on the performance for that quarter versus the planned performance. So again, yellow means it's below the goal, but above 85% of the goal, or 85% and above. A red would indicate it's below 85%, and a green would indicate that it's actually the goal, or performance is at the goal or above the goal. Next slide, please. This is a screenshot of the VETS demographic summary tab here. And again, everything on here is being computed from the participants information tab that we had discussed earlier here. You can see over here to the far left how we're displaying data on race in different ways. So we have a duplicated account, an unduplicated count, as well as where multiracial is put in there, where it's really not duplicating the racial category. So you have it displayed two ways for you on this particular report. As mentioned before, ethnicities is reported separately because of OMB requirements, and mentioned race is reported in two ways. Next slide, please. We've also added to the demographics summary tab 3 additional data elements. One is the homeless with family data element. We added in incarcerated veterans and also added in the homeless female as a reporting data element. Those 3 are of the 4 special population groups we had talked about earlier. Chronically homeless has always been a part of this form, and that would be the 4th special population group that VETS has been targeting in the past. Oh, sweet. I was wondering how that happened. I didn't do it. Thank you, Cindy. Next slide, please. This gets into the actual summary report itself. So based on what you've entered in those data entry sheets, the participant information tab and the exit tabs 1 through 4, it will feed the data in here to compute performance. For this to work, you have to have the data entered in those tabs we talked about, as well as in the plan goals chart. If the plan goals chart data is not in there, it will not show a proper plan versus actual comparison. For the plan versus actual comparison to work properly, information in section 1 at the very top of the form here has to be complete. Please make complete and have the right selections there. The items selected and highlighted in red over here, the period covered by the report and the initial POI for the grant award, are actually flagging the type of indicator that applies to your grant. So depending upon what grant you're operating and the period for the report, it flags it to do the plan versus actual comparison. The initial POI for the grant identifies the indicators that apply. The period covered by the report identifies the plan goals for the quarter that applies to this. So it's actually basing it on the quarter. So if you do a first quarter comparison, you enter a first quarter, but it's actually a second quarter report, it's actually comparing second quarter results to the first quarter plan figures, and that we wouldn't want to do that. So it's very important that the information be keyed in accurately here. Under this blue insert that we have on here, you're reporting in the grantee's name, the grant number for the project. You're also reporting in the state for the grantee, and you're also, the last data element, I believe, is the type of award, whether it's an initial award or an option year award, indicating there. As mentioned before, the stoplights here, depending upon what's glowing for your particular indicator there, has to be addressed in the technical performance narrative. So this will alert you to, in terms of identifying which indicators or data elements you have to address in the technical performance narrative itself. So if everything is done correctly here, it automatically calculates plan versus actual, tells you what your performance is on the indicators, and instructs you to address underperformance in the technical performance narrative. And the TPN, you can also put in your cap there as well. It's just kind of a streamlined approach. Instead of having to go back and asking for a cap, it's just automatically requiring a cap from you as part of the report that's being submitted. Data elements that were added to Section 2 in the lower section here, the number of carryover participants is now summarized on a quarterly basis as well as overall. Or so maybe it's, yeah, no, yeah. The number of participants co-enrolled in AJC services, it now reflects the new denominator for the placement rate using exiters instead of enrollments. It includes the indicator for the placement rate, or data element for the placement rate for chronically homeless. And it also includes the number of participants in one or more of the special population groups that have been identified in the PY16 FOA and also in the PY17 FOA. They're identified there too. Next slide. This is kind of the middle section of the Technical Performance Report form as you're moving down the form itself, showing some additional data elements that were either added or modified for this report. We added in the WIA Data Elements, as I mentioned earlier, and you'll see those reflected on the left-hand side over here. So based on the information you key in the PostExit Form and the Participant Information tab, it automatically calculates your performance on the WIA entered employment rate, retention rate, and average earnings retention, as well as the WIOA employment in the second quarter, employment in the fourth quarter, and median earnings in the second quarter after exit. Next slide. And the last thing to put on this form, as mentioned earlier, we're now reporting stand-down costs as part of this form. Next. Next, I'd like to cover the data export worksheet tabs and go over the process for submission in kind of a high-level fashion here. As with all the worksheets here, they are protected. There's unprotected areas, but the worksheets largely are protected in terms of the formulas, what you can see and can't see, and in terms of what you can do with the worksheets. All three export worksheet tabs are protected, and you can't make any changes in there, but you can actually see the data itself that's being reported. Next slide. As mentioned before, we have three export tabs. The Export 1 tab is actually exporting the plan goals information that was entered on that plan goals chart, the very first one, the VETS 701 chart, or I'm sorry, the VETS 700 chart. So it's taking those goals and actually putting them into a nice Excel spreadsheet for us. Export 2 is aggregating the data from the Technical Performance Workbook. So we're getting the aggregate performance displayed in that workbook that you're seeing, and it's going to go into a database for us as well. Export 3 is the individual records that are keyed into the system. From the Participant Information tab and also in those Post-Exit tabs, it's bringing in the individual level data. Now again, we don't want to have any sort of identifier in there like Social Security numbers or participant names. We want that to be, as scrambled as much as possible so we can identify it. But you know who it is. You can take that number and translate it back into a Social Security number or into the participant's name so you can actually key in data if there's some sort of error in the data. This will allow us, the Export 3 tab is going to allow VETS at the national office to do some much more robust data validation queries. So we can look at things and say if there's missing data or data doesn't make sense, we can send a report back to the DVET who can work with you, the grantee, to kind of educate you to get that information corrected in the future. Next slide, please. Now you ask, how is this so simple to do? In Excel, they have add-in functions in Excel that you can add in procedures. And one such one is displayed right here, where you can add in or merge data together. And the way it works is that you kind of specify, you dump all of the technical performance workbooks that have been certified by the DVET into one folder on your drive. You specify the tab that the data is located in. You specify the range for the data on that tab, and then you just hit the merge button. It automatically extracts the data and then pulls it into a merged data file. It will do it for all, let's say if you had 300 workbooks, it will do it for all 300 workbooks. Take the data from those export tabs and merge it into massive data files, really, if there's 300 there. The process that's in the DM is, well, DM is a draft, it's a director's memorandum, but it's a process that will be outlined later on. It's basically that the grantee submits the completed TPR to the DVET as required in the VPL. So if your due date is February 15th, has to be in by the 15th, or whatever date the DVET sets for you. They may want to do something earlier, and that could be. The DVET reviews the TPR to make sure it's complete, and also the TPN to make sure it's complete, and the data appear complete and reasonable. If it's complete and reasonable, the TPR is actually accepted by the DVET and uploaded into DOL's SharePoint site. From there, we kind of compile the data for doing extracts, do the merge at the national office level data to create these final data files. And then our goal right now is to create standard reports. We have a contractor working with us at the national office who is using dummy data that we have for these merged data files to create some standard reports similar to what we've had in VOPAR in the past. So I want to alert you that that's taking place, and that will likely be available, the canned reports available sometime later in February or early March, just to give you a notice there. We're working with our regions in terms of the types of reports they would like as well. Next slide, please. These are just some screenshots from two different files. The top one is from the Export Data tab itself. So this is an example of where we had some dummy data in there. You can see you have the where it says a part ID at the very top there. That's actually a combination of the unique number you assigned and the scrambled name that you have there. And that forms the basis for the unique record identifier for the individual. And then you can see how all of the other data is kind of brought in for each record. Each row in that top one indicates a separate participant there. The information that's imported there is active. It's always being updated. It includes everybody, enrollments as well as exiters. Unlike the VOPAR program in the past, you do not have to, we're not freezing data for each quarter. So this is really kind of a very much live and fluid workbook. So if you are in the third quarter and you need to make changes to second quarter data because it wasn't correct, you can make that change in the workbook itself and it will be reflected in the next quarter report, that change. So we're not asking you to change any sort of prior data in the past. What you enter in there will actually be correct. So the second quarter submission would overwrite data that we have for the first quarter submission, making the second quarter the most recent. The third quarter submission would overwrite data for the second quarter submission, making the third data that you've reported to us as being the most accurate. The bottom slide shows you how what it looks like when it comes into this merged data file. And it actually adds in a few other data elements there to indicate to us if there's problems with the data in terms of locating the individual TPR as well as possibly down to the individual level, or individual record that may have the issue. It gives us the location of the data file, gives us the actual data file name that's assigned to it. It gives us the sheet name that it came from, and then it gives you the actual individual data that was being imported there. So it gives you the location as well as the data for each merged data workbook here. Next slide. Here we're going to talk a bit about the change to the TPN summary report itself. Next slide. As I mentioned, the TPN now is better integrated with the TPR workbook itself. In the past, we had two technical performance narratives. There was one for quarters 1 through 4 and one through quarters 5 through 7. Those have been replaced. Now there is just one technical performance narrative submission to use. It's been streamlined greatly to make it easier to complete and submit. As I mentioned before, the actual versus planned comparisons that are identified in TPR are actually completed in or addressed into the TPN itself. Each critical indicator has a data element, has a stoplight associated with it. So if that performance indicator, for example, number placed, applies to your particular grant award, then that indicator will be highlighted on the TPR. And depending upon the color of the stoplight, you may have to address it in the TPN or not. Also adds in there non-critical data elements that are being treated for corrective action plan purposes. Percent receiving training services, there's still the 80% data or training requirement that's a part of the grant award, and that also extends in the PY17. And then there's also the 3 expenditure data elements, doing plan versus actual, that are part of the TPR. So if your expenditures are way off track in terms of underperformance, then we'd like some explanation as to why. Next slide, please. I guess I should indicate that on the indicators themselves, the stoplights, it's using that percent of goal, percent of target. So I think I mentioned earlier before that each performance measure, critical measure, is defined as a range where you have the goal that you've proposed in your grant award that applies to your grant award. Then you have 85% of that goal, which actually identifies the minimum acceptable performance level. So anything above the goal is considered, or at or above, is considered exceeding. Anything below that 85% is considered failure on an individual indicator, and anything occurring in that range itself is considered to be meeting minimum expectations. That is kind of the same approach we've used in the past. As I mentioned before, a yellow indicator means the underperformance has to be addressed on the TPN, kind of doing an explanation as to why performance is under what was planned right for that point in time. If you have a red indicator, it's requiring that a corrective action plan be developed. And as mentioned before, the TPN has a section for addressing follow-up results. On the TPR and the TPN, if follow-up does not apply to you, you do not do any data entry there, either for the plan goals or for the actual performance. So I just want to make that clear. You only provide information if it's required in your grant award. Now, beginning in PY17 going forward, all grant awards are going to have the requirement of collecting post-program employment earnings data. Next slide. Next, we'll talk about the stand down after action report, the summary report. Next. This form was almost a 3-page form that we had in the past. Currently, and I guess for the last year or so, we've been collecting stand down events have been funded by separate grants. They were not funded through the HVRP award itself. So we've had individual submissions for these stand-down grants, and they've been reporting using the stand-down after action report. That was basically a 3-page summary form. Now we're reducing to the 1 page, and also incorporating stand-down events into the HVR grant award if they want to do that, and having a single type of report that both individual stand-down grants or standalone stand-down grants have, as well as standalone grants that are part of a larger HVRP award. If your HVRP grant does not, you don't receive a stand-down grant, for example, you're not obligated or actually required to submit a stand-down after action report. I just want to make that clear. We don't want you submitting blank forms every time when you don't have an actual stand-down event applying to your grant. As mentioned before, the TPR and the TPN are due by the end of the month following the end of the reporting quarter, whereas the stand-down after action report is due 30 days after the completion of the stand-down event. And again, this form, like the others, is submitted directly to the DVET by email. Next slide, please. Next steps. As I mentioned before, we have a VPL that's been gone through extensive edits, and it's in its final version now, and should be published in the next week or so. So be on the lookout for that. And it incorporates everything we've talked about today. The VPL it's undergoing some very cosmetic changes, as well as the technical assistance guide that's associated with these forms. When I say cosmetic, it's like the names of the indicators might be slightly different depending upon the form that was used, and it's actually aligning all of the names of the form so they're actually identical in each one. So if I say TPR here, it says TPR there. If just as an example. Some have had slightly different types of acronyms associated with them. We're also drafting a process guidance for our regional office folks to use as they work with you in terms of reviewing the report submissions, as well as how they actually submit those reports to us and the types of reports they'll get back from us, us being the national office. As a reminder, the first set of reports are due February 15th. We have a contractor, as I mentioned before, that's working with us to develop standardized reports to be used by VETS. We're also drafting option year award guidance for PY 17, and we'll issue that very, very soon. I expect in the next couple of weeks or so. We plan to hold another webinar for grantees by the end of January to talk about changes to the option year award process. So just to let you know what's coming your way before it's actually issued, so you can ask some intelligent questions. And also not to frighten you or scare you when it comes out in written form. The option year award process, we're looking at streamlining considerably, making it so that if your performance is acceptable, that you don't have to go through this process of submitting caps and some other information as part of your application. We're looking at greatly streamlining it, so we're looking at trying to get the option year awards notices out to you by the end of April, depending upon your performance in those option years, for the option year application, excuse me. Also, we'll be updating the codes and kind of streamlining the TPR to make it run faster and get rid of any sort of errors that might be in there, or cosmetic errors, typos, whatever might be in there from this issue, and reissue the actual forms to grantees in PY 2017. And basically, I've talked about customizing the formulas for the stoplights because everybody will be put on the same set of indicators in the future. That's all I have for the presentation. I'm sure you have lots of questions. I'm sure there's things I should have covered I haven't. So I'll just open the phone line to you guys.
Okay, Brad, thank you very much. We do have quite a few questions. Before I start getting into those, I did just want to point out to everyone that in your the toolbar, that's the GoToWebinar toolbar, there is a list of handouts. If you didn't get a chance to download the forms from the actual webinar invitation, those forms are there, so you can access them through that handout link. You can actually download the forms there. If for some reason you're having a challenging opening a form, you can always email me and I'll help you get the forms that you need. Just as another reminder, we are recording this webinar, so it will be available to listen to again if you have questions. There's also a repeat session that's happening next Wednesday, January 18th at 2 p.m., so you can listen in again. And we are going to consolidate all the questions from both webinars into a fact sheet with written answers and questions, so you'll have that as another resource as well. So with that said, as I said, we do have quite a few questions. Brad, you just mentioned this, but I do want you to clarify. The first set of reports due February 15th is for the quarter that ended December 31st, PY of 2016, correct?
That is correct.
Okay, there was a question about that, so I wanted to clarify that. Another clarification that I think folks have gotten, but I just wanted to make sure. You've talked a lot about the follow-up that's happening. From here on out, the follow-up will be paid for through the option year grant funding, not through the original initial year grant, correct?
Correct.
Okay, excellent. So there's been a couple of questions about the stand down after action report and confusion about whether that was due 45 calendar days after the event or 30. So could you clarify that for folks?
Yeah, there's two reports they submit for those who receive stand-down event monies. One is the federal financial report. If you're a grantee that has a standalone stand-down grant, it's not associated with HVRP award. And the other one is the stand-down after action report itself. The financial report they would submit is due 45 days after the end of the quarter. The stand-down after action report is due 30 days after the conclusion of the stand-down event.
Great. Thank you so much for clarifying that. We also had just a very sort of technical question about the TPR workbook itself and how it scrolls. And I guess the way it's scrolling right now is the headings don't scroll to the second page, and is there a way to lock the headings in place so that they would stay at the top and you could see them regardless of what page you were on in the TPR?
Yes, I can do that, but I think you're allowed to do that as well. It's not one of those functions that's protected. But I can do that for all worksheets. Okay.
We also had a question about success stories and how they'll be handled. Are they going to be handled the same way as usual, being sent to the Goder and then uploaded to SharePoint, or is that process going to change?
No, it's still the same process.
Great. Let's see, I'm just scrolling through what else we have. We have a couple of questions around the new data elements that were added, the demographic data elements and definitions. So there was one question about how chronic homelessness would be determined for purpose of that demographic data. We also had questions about what constitutes an IVTP participant under that data, and also what constitutes a homeless veteran with a family. Does that have to be a dependent child or a spouse, or could it be other family members? So that's a bunch of questions in there, but they're all definition related.
Yeah, just to point out, all the definitions associated with the TPR or data elements are actually included in the technical assistance guide.
Great.
Did I gave that to you as well, yes.
Let's see what else we have. Do grantees need to input goals for the new WIA measures for the second and third quarter, or do they leave the goals that they have in their chart? Let's say, I'm going to read this word for word. Do grantees need to input goals for new WIA measures for second quarter, third quarter, and median earnings after exit? And if so, what do they put in the goals chart, or do they just leave the goals chart?
No, that wouldn't. I mean, if the indicators don't apply to your grant award, which currently they don't apply to any current grant award, then you would just leave that blank.
So you leave it blank for that would be something for
right.
PY17.
And PY17, and going forward, you put in actual goals for those indicators.
Now, then another question with your saying that VOPAR is going away, so there will not be a website for folks to log into any longer. They will just use the forms that have been shared?
Well, VOPAR will still be around, but it's not going to have current data in it. It's going to be just like PY15 going, backwards. All current data will be submitted through this new process, so nothing's being submitted through VOPAR itself. But VOPAR is still available if you wanted to go on and run reports on prior year's data.
So for the quarterly reports due now for February 15th of this year and moving forward, folks will not have to log into VOPAR to do reports. They'll just simply fill out these forms and follow the process as outlined?
Correct.
Great. Couple more definitions we added. Let's see. I'm just scrolling through. A couple of them are repeat questions that we've already asked. There was some question for clarification about the exporting process and the role that individual grantees have in the whole exporting section of what you were talking about. There was some confusion about what they do as far as exporting and what they don't do, and what's more appropriate.
Grantees don't do anything with that. Grantees have no role in exporting data. The tab itself is actually pulling out the data for us. The export is actually taking place at the national office level.
Great. Okay. Another question is just clarifying the spotlight indicators. So a yellow would indicate that you have to address it in your TPN. A red would indicate a cap as well as addressing it in the TPN. And would a green indicator mean that it wouldn't that particular goal, that performance indicator, would not have to be addressed at all in the TPN?
That's correct.
Great. We also have a question about corrective action plans for folks who are exceeding their planned goals. So folks who have greens, but not just greens because they're meeting the goal, but folks who are exceeding the goals, say at 100, 110, or even 120% of planned goals.
Yeah, we're not, I mean, it was kind of an informal, hasn't been published yet, but VETS has decided not to penalize grantees for overperformance.
Okay. Even though we can't hear folks, I'm sure there's some cheering, there's some silent cheering, I'm sure, going on, even though we can't hear that. Yeah,
there was a decision to reach, there was an email that went out in-house, and it's been a while, but they meant to, it will be in future guidance, let me put it that way, that's coming out.
Okay.
So no penalty for overperforming.
Great. Great news. There was a question specifically about VETS 701, Form 701, the B tab. It looks like when this particular person is looking at it, it looks like there's a split screen that has a sliding line between the screen. Not sure if you can answer that question, or if that's more of a follow-up question with that particular.
No, that's just how it's displayed. There's a view selection in Excel, and I'm pretty sure the view selection is not protected. So you should be able to go up there in the view and change the view and just deselect the split screen, and then it will go away.
Okay.
But as mentioned earlier, I'll make sure all forms are on the same look and feel until they scroll the same way. And I apologize for that. I didn't mean to confuse anybody.
Great. Let's see. Somebody's asking if there's a new form with all this information. As you said, there's the technical assistance guide is coming, and then there'll be fact sheets with answers to all these questions, correct?
That is correct.
And another question about AJC co-enrollments, and that was one of the new data elements that you explained, correct?
Mm-hmm. Correct.
Okay. We did have a question about folks who have currently completed their TPR for the quarter ending December 31st of 2016, and they're just wondering if there's a way for them to easily export the data from that version of the TPR into the new workbook.
Actually, there is, but you'd have to do it on a column-by-column basis. You can't just do like a mass copy and move over there. So, for example,
okay.
on if you know what I mean, you can copy columns and put them in there.
Okay, so you could cap each column and move it over.
Yeah, the coding is the same as in the old workbook for those non-new data elements.
Okay. Let's see. On the new TPR regarding the quarterly exit tab, since previously we've not exit participants the same quarter of completing the program, for example, getting placed, for this report there'll be no Q1 exiters. Would this be a problem with the data?
Run that by me again?
I'm
not sure I
going to
understand the question.
And this may be, Brad, a question that we can follow up directly with the individual asking it, and folks have the question. But previously they haven't, I guess there's processes that they don't exit participants the same quarter that they complete the program and get placed. That's the following quarter.
Yeah, that's in the current TPR, yes.
So what the question is, would that be a problem for the data in this TPR because they wouldn't have any exiters for that quarter, for Q1?
No, I mean, if they have no targets there and there's no data, then no, that wouldn't be a problem at all.
Okay. Let's see. Just a question. The forms that you had sent to me, that link, those are the updated forms, or will there be another version of forms that folks should wait before they start completing them?
I expect some cosmetic changes to come about. We're finding typos as I'm going through these sessions with staff as well as grantees, and just little things right now, but it's nothing major. So I would say hold off for, a week maybe. If you wanted to. You don't have to, of course. Okay.
So if folks have already started transferring data into those new forms, they can just use that version and they'd be okay for this quarter.
Exactly. It doesn't affect anything in terms of computing. It may just tweak the way it looks and feels, but there's nothing that's going to change the results.
Great. There's also a question about folks who are currently following up on participants from PY15, and if those folks will have to be transferred into the new TPRs because they are receiving follow-up services.
We're going to answer these. It's just one quarter, right?
This would be for, yes, for the PY15 grant.
Yeah, that would, Well, since it's part of their grant award, yeah, it's already part of the grant award right now, their period of performance, so they can report it in this TPR itself and not wait for the subsequent award.
Okay. There's also a question about whether there is a template for the caps that they should be using, or if that's something that comes directly from their voter, or if there'll be a template for the caps.
It's not really a template per se, but there are questions that are asked in the TPN itself, and directions in there allow them to kind of guide them through developing a cap.
Great, thank you. One question is, since follow-up services will be required in option years for previous years, there's a question of whether the HVRP award amounts will increase to allow for that additional spending.
Yes, and that should be proposed in your option year award process. Well, make sure that's included in there.
Okay, so include that need for funding in your option year request?
Yeah, I mean, but we're not expecting a huge amount. No more than maybe 3% of your total grant award.
Will there be a new tracking sheet to help collect the new data that's requested on the TPR?
A follow-up tracking sheet?
The question, yeah, a new tracking sheet to help collect those new data elements that they weren't previously collecting.
Ah. I didn't realize there was one. If you can send me an example, I can make sure we can draft one for you.
Okay, we'll put that in our notes. This is a question that I've had quite a few of over the last couple of weeks, Brad, so I'm going to try and answer it, and then you can sort of fill in. Folks have had trouble downloading the 700 series worksheet from the link. Because what you need to do is actually highlight that Excel workbook and then download it to your computer. Open it from your computer, correct?
That is correct. And it may prompt you for saying that the macros are disabled and you want to enable content. But that's when you can go to your PC and you open it in Excel.
Okay. So another question about do we go back to Q1 for the reporting? Yes, this is do you go back to Q1 or is this just for Q2? This is just for the quarter that ended December 31st and then moving forward, correct?
Correct. You're not going back and submitting a Q1 report. I mean, everything in here is cumulative. So as I mentioned before, the second quarter would overwrite the first quarter anyway.
Just so everyone understands, yes, we will make the PowerPoint slide available as well. With the recording, we'll have a PDF version of the PowerPoint slides. And then once it's completed, we'll also have the fact sheet, the Q&A sheet added in as well, that you'll be able to access all of them at a future date.
Any other questions?
I'm scrolling through them. Some of them are repeat questions.
Okay.
One person asked, since they didn't set a chronically homeless goal for the beginning of this grant, do they have to set one now? No, that would just be moving forward for new grants. Correct?
Correct, in PY17. Yeah, it starts in PY17.
There is a question, and I'm not sure if this is in the purview of today's webinar, but I'm going to ask it, Brad, and if not, we can put a hold on it and pass it on to the folks who could answer it. We've heard that there will be a new rule that any pertinent goal is under 50% of goal, and a person is put on a grantee is put on a cap, they would not be eligible for renewal. Is that a question for today, or is that a question that we should I should pass on to someone else for?
It's not a question for today. It's going to be addressed in the option year award guidance that we'll discuss later this month.
Okay, so option year award guidance. Make sure once we have dates set for that, we'll make sure folks know about that.
Right.
Let's see what else we have. Folks are asking if they need to go back to Q1 to change the data elements, and the answer to that is no, just start this new reporting with the Q2 report, correct?
Yeah, just put your data there, you do the data entry screens and submit your report.
People are asking about the tag. Is that been finalized yet, Brad?
It's still being tweaked a little bit. I noticed I had made some errors in there, so I should have, actually should have it done tomorrow, the final version of it. And I can post it up there or send it to you for distribution if you like.
Okay, maybe do both and we'll make sure folks have access to that as well.
Okay.
Also, one of the DVETs has asked us to clarify for folks that you should get your reports to your DVET before February 15th to allow time for them to review them. But that is an extension from the normal date, which would be the end of January. So you have an extension, but do try and get these reports as soon as possible to your DVETs.
Correct.
A couple of these questions I think we have since answered. They came, by the time I'm scrolling through them, I think they've been answered, so I'm just going to see if there's anything new. Let's see. I apologize for the delay, folks. There's a lot of questions that I'm scrolling through as quickly as possible. There is a question from DVETS about when they're going to receive final guidance about everything, just to make sure that they have everything they need for answering questions of their individual grantees.
Yes, I mean, that was the purpose of, we actually had a webinar with DVETS Tuesday of this week, covering the same information, but we'll do a follow-up later this month for them as well.
Okay, great. Let's see. So a couple of folks asking a similar question. If somebody was placed in the first quarter and they used, in the old format, they used to be exited in the second, will they have to change that, or will that exit become automatic when that new data is put into the TPR? So for example, you're exiting someone in the second quarter who you haven't actually entered because you entered them in the old format.
Yeah, that will have to be changed, the quarter of exit.
Okay. And if folks have specific questions about that, Brad, can we connect them to you about how to do that, or perhaps to their DVET?
Absolutely.
There is a question about the IVTP grantees that were awarded in 2015 and that are still doing follow-up this year. Do they have to use these reporting forms as well, or is that?
No, they're actually exempt. The way the legislation was written, and when the grant officer had to revise the follow-up period, what was covered under the grant award, it didn't affect the IVTP grants. It affected the HVRP grants, the typical ones, not the IVTP. Okay. So they still report their quarters. Yeah.
Okay. We have a question from if regional staff will be able to do some exporting of data and generating reports on a regional level.
Actually, the data will be on a national level, but they'll have access to the national level as well as regional level data.
Okay. And again, there is this question. It sounds like that folks may have to enter some Q1 data into the new TPR if they're exited, if somebody is being exited because they were placed in Q1, just to make the numbers work. Is that correct?
Say that again.
The question is, does the Q1 data need to be entered into the new TPR if they're exiting someone in Q2 because they were placed in Q1?
Oh, yes. That is correct.
There is a question about a couple of folks have already completed their reports using the old format, but no, they do have to use these new forms for this Q2 data, correct?
That is correct.
And the question is, the tag suggests that the critical performance indicators have changed and there are 4 of them. Does this apply to all program year grants or just moving forward?
The 4 critical indicators apply. There should be a table in there that actually shows the critical indicators that apply to your grant. The 4 that you're referencing are probably the PY17 going forward, and they're not in effect yet.
Okay. Okay, I think we've gotten through everyone, or all the ones I have. I think scrolling through, I think most of them have been answered. There was a couple of duplicate questions. I'm just seeing. We did have someone say that grantees, you have to transfer your Q1 data into the new workbook for the numbers to work.
Correct.
And that's coming from a couple of different VETS and GOTers, so let's underscore that. You have to transfer your Q1 data into the new workbook in order for the numbers and all of the formulas and everything else to work. So I'm underscoring that again. It's 3:27, so we are about 3 minutes ahead of our allotted hour and a half, Brad. I think we've gotten through all the questions. If there's anything else you want to emphasize in the last minute, what we will do moving forward is all of the questions are going to be typed up with answers, and that will be included, posted eventually once we've had the webinar from next week as well. We will have a PowerPoint of the slides and then also the recording of at future times. So anything else, Brad, you wanted to add at the last minute?
Just to note that we'll do another webinar, follow-up webinar on this one for questions that you may have after you've started using the workbook and all that stuff and transferring data.
Great. Well, thank you, Brad, for taking the time today. We appreciate it. Again, there is another repeat session. It's not new information, but if there was a section of it that you want to hear again, or maybe you start doing your form and by next week you have a couple questions, we are doing a repeat session next Wednesday at 2 p.m. Eastern. So the link to register for that was also in the monthly update, but if you need that again, you can email me, cborden@nchb.org. Thank you all very much. Brad, thank you, and I wish everyone a happy weekend.
Thank you, guys.